The auctioneer's gavel struck the podium with a thunderous crack that seemed to shatter the very soul of Riverside Heights. "Sold!" he bellowed, his voice carrying across the packed auditorium like a death knell. Maria Gonzalez clutched her teenage daughter's hand so tightly that Isabella winced, both of them staring in disbelief at the community center they had called home for over a decade. The building that had housed after-school programs for disabled children, ESL classes for immigrant families, and senior citizen support groups was now nothing more than a commodity, purchased by an anonymous buyer for twice its assessed value. "This can't be happening," whispered Mrs. Chen, her weathered hands trembling as she watched the paperwork being shuffled on stage. Her grandson Tommy, who had autism, had learned to speak his first words in the center's specialized therapy program. Behind her, dozens of families sat in stunned silence, their dreams evaporating like morning mist. The same building where wheelchairs had rolled freely, where Spanish and English mingled in harmony, where generations had found hope, was being torn away from them without warning, without consultation, without mercy. Just 12 hours earlier, the Riverside Heights Community Center had been buzzing with its usual Thursday evening activities. The main hall echoed with the laughter of children in the adaptive sports program, while the art room glowed with the concentrated faces of elderly residents painting watercolors. Maria had been leading her weekly citizenship prep class, helping families navigate the complex path to American citizenship, when the first whispers began to circulate. "Did you hear about the notices?" asked Rosa, a young mother whose son attended the daycare program. "What notices?" Maria had responded. But the concern in Rosa's eyes already told her everything she needed to know. The Riverside Heights Homeowners Association had been a source of minor irritation for most residents, known primarily for sending passive-aggressive letters about lawn maintenance and holiday decorations. HOA President Karen Mitchell had held the position for 3 years, ruling with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove of neighborhood improvement rhetoric. Her perfectly manicured suburban home stood in stark contrast to the diverse working-class families who comprised the majority of the development, while others struggled with mortgage payments and rising utility costs. Karen drove her pristine BMW to weekly spa appointments and quarterly trips to her vacation home in the Hamptons. The community center had been the heart of Riverside Heights for 15 years, originally built with federal grants and community fundraising efforts. Its founding had been a triumph of grassroots organizing, bringing together families from dozens of ethnic backgrounds who had scraped together donations, volunteered countless hours, and transformed an empty lot into a beacon of hope. The building housed everything from toddler playgroups to senior citizen chess clubs, from job training programs to emergency food distribution. For many residents, it was more than a facility. It was proof that their neighborhood cared about its most vulnerable members. Maria had emigrated from El Salvador 20 years ago, carrying nothing but her nursing degree and an unshakable belief in the American dream. She had found work at the local hospital, raised 2 children as a single mother, and gradually built a life of modest comfort and deep community connections. The community center had been instrumental in her family's integration, providing English classes, childcare, and a network of support that sustained them through difficult times. Her daughter Isabella, now 17 and bound for college, had learned to read in the center's library and developed her leadership skills through its youth programs. "We need to talk about the financial situation," Karen had announced at the previous month's HOA meeting, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The meeting had been sparsely attended, as usual, with most residents either working evening shifts or caring for family members. "The community center is operating at a significant deficit," she had continued, flourishing a thick stack of papers that no one was permitted to examine closely. "We're looking at a budget shortfall of nearly $200,000. And unless we take decisive action, The entire association could face bankruptcy. The claim had seemed suspicious to Maria, who served on the center's volunteer board and had access to the monthly financial reports. The facility was well used, with consistent rental income from community events and steady funding from various grant programs. But Karen had dismissed questions with bureaucratic doublespeak, insisting that difficult decisions were necessary to ensure the long-term fiscal health of our community. The meeting had ended with vague promises of exploring all options and keeping residents informed. But nothing had prepared them for the bombshell that arrived in their mailboxes on a cold Tuesday morning. The auction notice had been deliberately confusing, buried in legal jargon, and posted with the minimum required notice period. Due to insurmountable debt obligations, it read, "The Riverside Heights Community Center property will be sold at public auction to satisfy outstanding financial obligations." The sale date was set for just 1 week later, giving residents virtually no time to organize a response or seek legal counsel. Maria had read the notice 3 times before the full impact hit her. And then she had done something she rarely did. She had screamed. The phone tree activated within hours, with urgent calls spreading across the neighborhood like wildfire. "Have you seen the notice?" became the standard greeting, followed by voices thick with disbelief and rage. Parents pulled their children from programs. Elderly residents wept openly in the hallways, and staff members began updating their resumes with heavy hearts. The center's director, a devoted social worker named James Park, had been caught completely off guard by the announcement and spent the day fielding angry calls from funders and community partners who had invested years of resources into the facility. By Thursday evening, the main hall had been transformed into a meeting space filled with over 200 residents, their faces reflecting a mixture of anger, fear, and determination. Maria had volunteered to facilitate the discussion, her nursing background having taught her to remain calm under pressure. "We need to understand what's happening here," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the packed room. "This is our center, built with our sweat and our dollars, and no one has the right to sell it without our consent." The crowd erupted in applause, but Maria held up her hand for silence. "We need facts, not just emotions. We need to know exactly how this happened and what our legal options are." She had spent the previous day researching HOA regulations and property law, discovering that the association's bylaws required community input on major financial decisions. "According to our own governing documents," she continued, "the sale of community property requires a majority vote of all homeowners, not just a decision by the board." An elderly man in the front row stood up slowly, his voice shaking with controlled fury. "My name is Robert Chen, and I've lived in this neighborhood for 30 years. I helped lay the foundation for this building with my own hands." He gestured toward the walls around them, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "My grandson learned to walk in this gymnasium, and my wife taught citizenship classes here until the day she died. This isn't just a building, it's the soul of our community." A young woman near the back of the room raised her hand urgently. "I'm a paralegal," she announced, "and I've been reviewing the HOA's financial records. Something doesn't add up about this debt claim." She pulled out a folder thick with documents, her expression grim. "The association's annual budget shows consistent surpluses for the past 5 years, and the community center's operating expenses have actually decreased due to volunteer labor and energy efficiency improvements." The revelation sent a murmur of excitement through the crowd. But Maria knew they needed more than suspicions to challenge the sale. "We need to organize," she declared, her voice growing stronger with each word. "We need to file injunctions, demand transparency, and show up in force at that auction tomorrow. They're counting on us to be passive, to accept this theft without fighting back. But we're not going to let them destroy our community without a battle." The next morning dawned gray and cold, with a bitter wind that seemed to mirror the mood of the residents gathering outside the community center. Maria had barely slept, spending the night coordinating with local attorneys and drafting press releases to send to area newspapers. By 7 a.m., over 100 people had assembled, many carrying handmade signs reading, "Save our center" and "Stop the theft." The diversity of the crowd was striking: elderly couples with walkers, parents pushing strollers, teenagers with backpacks, and disabled individuals in wheelchairs, all united by their love for the building behind them. Karen Mitchell arrived at exactly 9 o'clock, stepping out of her BMW with the calculated confidence of someone who expected easy victory. She wore a tailored business suit and carried a leather briefcase, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the wind. "Good morning, everyone," she called out with false cheerfulness, as if addressing a garden party rather than a community in crisis. "I understand there are some concerns about today's proceedings, but I want to assure you that this sale is both legal and necessary." "Legal doesn't mean right," shouted Isabella, Maria's daughter, her teenage voice cutting through the morning air with surprising authority. She had inherited her mother's passion for justice and her father's talent for public speaking, though she had never needed to use both skills in such a high-stakes situation. "You're stealing from families who built this place with their own hands." Karen's smile never wavered, but her eyes flashed with irritation. "I understand emotions are running high, but we need to focus on facts, not feelings. The association faces genuine financial obligations that cannot be ignored." She gestured toward the auction setup, where workers were arranging folding chairs and testing a sound system. "The sale will proceed as scheduled, and I encourage everyone to accept this decision with grace and dignity." The crowd responded with a roar of disapproval, but Maria stepped forward to address Karen directly. "We have questions about these supposed financial obligations," she said, her voice calm but firm. "The community has a right to examine the records and verify the claims before any sale proceeds." She held up a thick folder of documents. "Our own analysis suggests that the association is actually in excellent financial health." For the first time, Karen's composure cracked slightly. "The board has thoroughly reviewed all financial matters," she replied, her voice taking on a defensive edge. "We don't have time for amateur audits and second-guessing. The sale has been legally advertised, and the process will continue as planned." She turned toward the building, clearly hoping to end the conversation, but the crowd began to move as one toward the entrance. What followed was the most organized act of civil disobedience in Riverside Heights history. Led by Maria and Robert Chen, the residents formed a human chain across the main entrance, linking arms and beginning to sing "We Shall Overcome" in multiple languages. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders. Elderly residents sat in folding chairs blocking doorways, and teenagers used their phones to live stream the protest to social media. The message was clear: the auction could not proceed if the community refused to allow it. Karen's face flushed red as she realized the scale of the resistance. "This is illegal assembly," she shouted, though her voice was nearly drowned out by the singing and chanting. "I'm calling the police." She fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking with rage, while the crowd continued to grow as neighbors who had heard about the protest began arriving to show their support. The police arrived within 20 minutes, but their response was far from what Karen had expected. Officer Martinez, a 15-year veteran of the force whose own children had attended programs at the center, approached Maria with obvious reluctance. "Ma'am, we've received reports of illegal assembly, but I need to understand the situation before taking any action." His tone suggested sympathy for the protesters, and he made no move to begin dispersing the crowd. Maria stepped forward to address the officer. her nursing training having taught her to remain calm under pressure. Officer Martinez, we're exercising our right to peaceful protest and demanding transparency from our elected officials. We have evidence that this sale is based on false financial claims, and we're asking for a delay until the community can review the records. She handed him a copy of the financial analysis that had been prepared overnight. While the officer reviewed the documents, the crowd began to organize itself into a more sustainable blockade. Residents took turns maintaining the human chain, while others distributed water bottles and snacks to sustain the protest. Isabella had appointed herself as the social media coordinator, posting updates every few minutes to Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter with hashtags like Save Our Center and Community Over Profit. The posts were already being shared hundreds of times, drawing attention from local news outlets and advocacy groups. By noon, the story had reached the local television news, with reporters interviewing protesters and attempting to get comments from Karen, who had barricaded herself inside the building with the auctioneer and several potential buyers. The visual contrast was powerful outside, a diverse crowd of families defending their community space, while inside, a small group of officials conducting business behind closed doors. The optics were devastating for Karen's position, and she knew it. As the afternoon wore on, the protest began to attract support from unexpected quarters. Local business owners arrived with donated food and supplies, having recognized many of the protesters as longtime customers and neighbors. The president of the Teachers' Union brought a delegation of educators who had worked with the center's programs. Even some members of the city council began to appear, drawn by the media attention and the compelling nature of the residents' cause. Inside the building, Karen was discovering that conducting an auction under siege was more complicated than she had anticipated. The auctioneer, a thin man with nervous eyes, kept glancing toward the windows where protesters' faces were visible. "This is highly irregular," he complained, mopping sweat from his forehead despite the cool temperature. "I've never conducted a sale under these circumstances. Perhaps we should consider postponing until the situation stabilizes." "Absolutely not," Karen snapped, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking completely. "We have legal authority to proceed, and we're not going to be intimidated by a mob." She gestured dismissively toward the windows, but her hands were shaking with suppressed anxiety. "The sale will proceed as scheduled, regardless of the theatrical display outside." The auction began at exactly 2 o'clock, with the auctioneer's voice barely audible over the chanting and singing from outside. Only a handful of buyers had shown up, most of them looking uncomfortable with the circumstances surrounding the sale. The bidding was lackluster, with long pauses between offers and an atmosphere of uncertainty that made everyone involved nervous about the legitimacy of the proceedings. Outside, Maria had organized the crowd into shifts, ensuring that the blockade could be maintained indefinitely while allowing people to rest and attend to family obligations. The protest had taken on a festival atmosphere, with children playing games between the linked arms of their parents and elderly residents sharing stories about the center's history. Local musicians had arrived with guitars and drums, leading the crowd in protest songs that echoed across the neighborhood. As evening approached, the story took an unexpected turn that would transform the entire conflict. A young reporter named Sarah Williams had been investigating the financial claims behind the sale, and her research had uncovered a connection that sent shockwaves through the community. The anonymous buyer, who had ultimately won the auction, was not a faceless corporation or distant investment group, but rather Mitchell Development LLC, a company owned by Karen's cousin, real estate developer Marcus Mitchell. Sarah's discovery, posted on the local news website just as the auction concluded, revealed the true scope of the corruption. Marcus Mitchell specialized in converting community spaces into luxury condominiums, and he had been quietly acquiring properties throughout the region using similar tactics. The insurmountable debt that had justified the sale was entirely fictional, created through creative accounting and inflated consulting fees paid to companies that Marcus also owned. The entire scheme had been designed to transfer valuable community property to private hands at below-market prices. The revelation hit the crowd like an electric shock, transforming anger into rage and despair into determination. "They're stealing from us," Isabella shouted, her young voice carrying across the assembled families. "They're destroying our community to make themselves rich." The crowd's response was immediate and overwhelming, with chants of "corruption" and "prosecute" drowning out all other sound. Maria felt the shift in the crowd's energy and knew that the situation had reached a critical moment. "We need to act smart," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had emerged as a natural leader. "We have the evidence we need to stop this theft, but we need to use the legal system, not just our anger." She held up her phone, showing the news article that had just been published. "This proves fraud, and fraud invalidates any sale." Inside the building, Karen was frantically trying to contact her lawyer, while the auctioneer packed up his equipment with obvious haste. The news article had been forwarded to her phone by several sources, and she realized that her carefully planned scheme was unraveling in real time. "This is temporary," she muttered to herself, but her voice lacked conviction. "They can't prove anything concrete." The crowd maintained its vigil through the night, with families taking turns to ensure that the building remained under community protection. Local restaurants donated coffee and sandwiches, while neighboring communities sent messages of support and solidarity. The story had gone viral on social media, with Wanxiang Save Our Center trending locally and drawing attention from national advocacy groups focused on housing justice and community development. By morning, the scene had transformed into a full-scale occupation, with tents and sleeping bags arranged in organized rows across the parking lot. Parents had called in sick to work, students had skipped classes, and elderly residents had arranged for extended care services so they could participate in the protest. The message was clear: the community was prepared to maintain its resistance for as long as necessary to reclaim their center. The breakthrough came at exactly 10:30 a.m., when Mayor Patricia Rodriguez arrived with a convoy of city officials and legal representatives. A pragmatic politician who had built her career on community responsiveness. She had been monitoring the situation since the previous day and had consulted with the city attorney about the legal implications of the sale. "I'm here to announce that the city is filing an emergency injunction to halt the sale of the community center," she declared, her voice carrying easily across the gathered crowd. The announcement triggered an explosion of cheers and applause, with families hugging each other and elderly residents wiping away tears of relief. But Mayor Rodriguez held up her hand for silence, indicating that she had more to say. Additionally, based on evidence of fraudulent financial reporting and conflicts of interest, the district attorney's office has opened a criminal investigation into the actions of the HOA board. All involved parties should expect to be contacted by law enforcement in the coming days. Inside the building, Karen was watching the mayor's announcement through a window, her face pale with shock and fear. The cousin who had seemed like such a valuable ally was now a criminal liability, and the financial records she had manipulated were about to be scrutinized by forensic accountants. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her lawyer. "Do not speak to anyone without representation. This is serious." The legal proceedings that followed were swift and decisive. Forensic accountants discovered that the HOA's financial records had been systematically falsified, with nearly $300,000 in community funds diverted to shell companies controlled by Karen and her cousin. The insurmountable debt that had justified the sale was entirely fictional, while the actual financial position of the association was strong enough to support the community center for decades to come. Karen's arrest came 3 weeks later, with news cameras capturing her being led away in handcuffs from her pristine suburban home. The charges included fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, and violation of fiduciary duty, with potential sentences totaling over 20 years in prison. Her cousin Marcus faced similar charges in connection with his role in the scheme, and their assets were frozen pending restitution to the community. The aftermath of the crisis brought changes that extended far beyond the simple preservation of the community center. The HOA was restructured with new bylaws requiring transparency and community input on all major decisions. Maria was elected as the new president, running on a platform of accountability and inclusive governance. The center's programs were expanded with the recovered funds, adding new services for disabled residents and immigrant families. Isabella, whose leadership during the protest had impressed college admissions officers, received a full scholarship to study public policy with a focus on community development. Her essay about the experience, titled "The Day We Saved Our Soul," became a rallying cry for student activists across the country. "I learned that democracy isn't something that happens to you," she wrote. "It's something you do, every day, with your neighbors and your community." The community center reopened 6 months later with a celebration that filled every room and spilled out onto the surrounding grounds. The walls were lined with photographs documenting the protest, the investigation, and the victory that had preserved the heart of Riverside Heights. Children played in the same gymnasium where their parents had once linked arms in defiance, while elderly residents shared stories of the struggle with younger generations who would inherit the legacy of their courage. Maria stood in the main hall, watching families from dozens of backgrounds celebrate together, and felt a profound sense of gratitude for the crisis that had revealed the strength of her community. "We didn't just save a building," she reflected, addressing the crowd that had gathered for the reopening ceremony. "We saved our ability to believe in each other, to fight for what matters, and to create the kind of community where everyone belongs." The story of Riverside Heights became a case study in community organizing programs across the country, demonstrating how ordinary people could challenge corruption and protect their shared spaces. But for the residents who had lived through the crisis, the real victory was simpler and more profound. They had learned that their community was worth fighting for, and that when they stood together, they were powerful enough to protect what they loved most. Years later, as new families moved into the neighborhood and children grew up in the programs that had almost been lost, the community center remained a testament to the power of collective action and the importance of vigilance in protecting democratic institutions. The bronze plaque installed near the main entrance read simply, "Dedicated to the residents who refuse to surrender their community to corruption, and to all who remember that democracy requires participation, not just hope." The legacy of the struggle lived on in the countless small acts of civic engagement that had become routine in Riverside Heights residents who attended every HOA meeting, neighbors who checked on elderly community members, and young people who saw public service as a calling rather than a career. The community center had been saved, but more importantly, the community itself had been transformed into something stronger, more cohesive, and more committed to the values that made democracy possible. In the end, the crisis had revealed a fundamental truth about American communities. They are only as strong as the people who are willing to fight for them, and they can only survive when ordinary citizens refuse to accept that corruption and injustice are inevitable. The community center stood as proof that with courage, determination, and solidarity, even the most vulnerable communities could protect themselves from those who would exploit their trust and steal their future.